Hello everyone, welcome to our first webinar. I'm Sangeeta Vasani. I'm a family support practitioner at Brent Specialist Academy Trust. Today's webinar focus will be on communication and interaction. Joining us is Ellie Cornford, and Ellie will be answering questions on communication interaction brought forward by parents. Before we start, I just want to make you aware of a few points. All participants' audio and video will be muted and hidden. You will only see and hear Ellie and me. This webinar will be recorded, but be assured only Ellie and I will be visible and audible. Your names will not be displayed. Direct chat, visible only to Ellie and I, might be enabled at the end of the meeting for further questions if we have any time. So, shall we get started?
Let's do that.
So our first question is, my child doesn't speak, so I don't know what they want.
Okay, so it's a common question that we get asked as speech and language therapists. And children tend to show us in other ways what it is that they want or need. So if we observe them carefully, we can spot patterns in the way that they might look at us, go to things they want, pull us around, look at the things they want, maybe make a noise or change their facial expression and so on. And it's these moments when a child is really motivated by something that they can't access or achieve on their own that are the most powerful teaching moments for showing them a way of asking for the thing that they want. And obviously some children can copy spoken words, and then that's how they learn to say them independently. And other children can't copy what their communication partners say, but instead they could potentially learn to copy a different mode of communicating. So it might be a Makaton sign, or it might be a symbol-based system of some form. So some children learn to point to symbols on a communication board. Some children learn to give a symbol as part of the picture exchange communication system. So really thinking a little bit about AAC, or alternative and augmentative communication, making sure that children have a way of communicating, even if it's not vocal to begin with.
Yeah, that sounds good. I guess for parents, this situation would be even harder if the child is upset or distressed. And again, you were talking about just seeing their body language and their expression just to kind of gauge what could be wrong with the child, and then use that opportunity in that moment to try and teach some kind of AAC or communication.
Absolutely, because when a child's distressed and you don't know why, that's really difficult. It's horrible. You feel like you can't really help them, and it's important to acknowledge that we all tend to lose a little bit of our capacity to communicate when, for some reason, whatever reason, we're not feeling great. Maybe we're tired or upset, feeling a bit stressed, maybe not very well. So sometimes it's important for us to reduce our expectations at that point, and maybe at the same time increase the level of support we're providing. So if a child's usually able to tell us something in one way, like it might be a vocal child, then they might benefit from having some symbols available when they need help with repairing and communication breakdown. So if something's upset them or annoyed them, or if they're not really calm enough to communicate as they usually would. And similarly, if they're already a symbol user, then they might need a simpler board or something like that to have fewer options when they need to just communicate, I either want this thing or this thing to make me feel better. So again, thinking about AAC, some signs or symbols could help with this. And when children are upset, it's generally best to try and avoid, if you can, talking about something that's upset or annoyed them while they're still in that heightened state of distress. They might need our support to calm down first and regulate. And sometimes we just need to think about showing the child some ways that they could do that. It's different for every child. It could be modeling slow, deep breaths, or some children respond well to being shown something they can do with their hands or something with their jaw to help get that kind of calming, organizing feedback. So your OT, your occupational therapist, can really help with this. They might be able to suggest some strategies or some activities that could help. And the reason why that's also really good is that it can mean that it sort of helps you avoid just offering the child loads of different things that they usually like when they're upset, because you really want them to calm down. It might be tempting, but we have to be careful that we're not just teaching the child that should they wish to be offered all kinds of their favourite things, all they have to do is stop crying or shouting, and then they'll get that sort of big menu of things will appear. So maybe helping them to calm down first, and then thinking about what do they want, what was the problem, and the communication will be better enabled because they'll be calmer. But then I think also if the child's distressed or upset because they don't know how to show you what they want, or because you're not understanding them in some way, it'll be really important to maybe figure out through trial and error what they do want, and then if possible show them a more appropriate way of asking for it.
Okay, brilliant, thank you. So our next question is, my child refuses to use the communication board and hides it in the cupboard.
Okay. So it's really great to have communication boards at home as a mode of AAC. So well done for starting that and for persevering with that. It's really important that any mode of AAC is paired with positive experiences, where initially the demands should be really, really low and reinforcement should be really high, because we need the child to really realise the value of that system that we've given them and understand why using it is going to be more valuable for them than not using it in the long run. So in that particular case where a child's showing quite clearly that at the moment they're not particularly interested in using that communication board and they're hiding it away, we may need to really take a good few steps back and reduce the expectations. Maybe begin by just having the board just in the room, same room as the child some of the time, and then look for opportunities when they're really happily engaged in a motivating activity that you can gradually bring that board closer into them. Try to engage with them on their own agenda and reinforce them just for tolerating the board being in the room or on the table or on the floor next to them in that activity. And then as they get better at tolerating that, then you can gradually start to begin to model using the board again, because that's really the way that we teach the use of these systems, especially a communication board, is just through modeling. And sometimes it can take months of modeling with no expectation on the child to copy before they start to use it, but they are learning all that time. They're learning from watching, and if they do begin to look at or use the board, we need to remember always to try and honour any attempts that they do make to communicate as quickly as possible, so that that board becomes paired with those positive experiences of getting the things that I want, having mum or dad's attention, being involved in an activity that I really like. I think some people also sometimes worry that if they use AAC with their child, so signing or symbols, that it might mean their child won't begin to talk.
Yeah.
And that's a really common question that we get asked. It's a really valid concern, but it's also something that the research says we really shouldn't worry about. Like, if anything, the opposite is true, that giving someone an effective and functional mode of communication can actually mean that they're able to get their needs and wants communicated and known, and they're experiencing language, they're developing their language. And in some cases, children do develop speech after they've been using a different system, an AAC system, and some don't, but they get very proficient at using their AAC, so they have that functional way of communicating, which makes such a difference for their independence, their way of quality of life.
Yeah, that sounds really good. So I guess the key message is just to be patient and keep the sort of, don't put too much pressure on them, and just make it available in the fun times.
Absolutely, yeah, and show how it can be used with those low expectations. And if you think about how babies learn to speak, they don't do anything like what we're doing for a really long time, and so it's the same when we're showing someone how to use a different system.
Okay, great, thank you. So next we've got, my child communicates with some family members but not others. My child talks to him but not to other people.
Okay, So I'll talk about those two separately, although they are kind of similar and linked. So obviously it's understandably frustrating if you know that your child can say some words, or you know that they can communicate well in an alternative way, but only in some situations, and then they don't do it in other situations. I think the key here is that generalization is a really important part of that learning process, especially for children with autism, because typically children tend to be able to learn something in one setting and then apply it in lots of other situations without having to relearn, and that's what we call generalizing the skill. But children with autism often struggle more to do that, and they do need to be taught specifically how to transfer their skills from one environment or one person to another. So in the case where like one or some family members may be having more success than others in communicating with the child, it might be important to see what strategies that those people are using to support the child to communicate. Maybe they ask fewer questions so the child feels less pressure. Perhaps they find it a little bit easier to spot what the child's interested in and then follow their lead. Generally speaking, as you've already said, Sangeeta, we do obviously always advise against trying to force a child to communicate, because we really want to avoid making communication like a negative and aversive experience that can be really traumatic, and it can obviously have the opposite effect to what we want. So your child speech and language therapist can always advise you on general strategies to support communication, and then you could look at talking to your wider network of family and friends about what you found that has worked and whether they could maybe try some of those same strategies as well. With children who say things on their own agenda, talking to themselves, but they don't talk in situations with other people, it can be quite confusing, because it seems like they can talk but they don't do it with intention to communicate with us. And in those situations, I normally try and encourage people to think about the means, reasons and opportunities model for communication. So if a child isn't communicating effectively, it's often because there are going to be some barriers in one of those three areas. So we need to make sure they have a means of communicating that works for them. So again, if they're not vocal, it could be a form of AAC across a range of different functions of language. And then they also need lots of varied opportunities to practice that. So in the case of that child who's vocalizing to themselves, it's probably a reasons barrier that we need to look at for why they might not be communicating at some other times. And some children really present as not being very highly motivated to communicate with others. So it's up to us then as communication partners to find ways to build that motivation. So if you find yourself in that situation where a child is maybe labeling things to themselves when they're contained within their own play, but they're not asking for anything or commenting or greeting in other situations, I would definitely advise to contact your speech and language therapist, because they'll be able to advise you on how you could work out maybe what the exact problem is and try to solve it with you. And I'll just plug our email address if that's okay while we're here, because you can always email the SALT team. It's just salt@manor.brent.sch.uk, and that's for all BSAT parents. So just because it has Manor in the title doesn't mean it's not for the Avenue children as well. So please do email us if you have any of these specific problems, or if you want more information on anything that we're talking about.
Brilliant, great. So moving on, our next question is, my child has just started to say a couple of words. How can I make them say more?
That's great. That's such an exciting time when a child first starts speaking, or maybe they use a sign or point to a symbol for the first time. And as we said before, it's really important to remember that it does take a long time to learn how to communicate. You know, babies experience people communicating with and around them for a lot of months before we'd expect them to start speaking. And if a child's development's delayed, they might start speaking later, but they also might progress more slowly once they do start speaking. So it's really important to celebrate every tiny step of progress that they make, because we have to acknowledge that what they're learning to do is something that's actually quite hard. So my advice would be, continue to model lots of words and phrases relevant to the situation, and always try and follow exactly where the child's interest or attention is in that moment, so that you're labeling the thing that they're looking at. They're more likely to associate that new word that they hear with the thing that's captured their attention at that time. But again, try not to demand that they copy you. So just labeling or commenting on things is really valuable, and just model using language for lots of different functions. So you might be greeting, you might be asking a question, you might just be commenting for information, you might be trying to draw someone's attention to something. So we don't want our children just to learn how to request, we want them to have that varied use of language. And if they do say something or communicate using a symbol or a sign, then when you model back, you can add an extra word to show them how they can maybe expand that, what they've said. But again, with no expectation on them to copy, just showing them how they could say a slightly longer phrase next time, or add a new word. Again, it's really important to think about reinforcement as well, because we are trying to teach a new skill here. So reinforce any attempts to communicate, and that could look like giving them your attention, praising them, joining in with what they're doing, looking what they're looking at, giving them something they've asked for, or something you know that they like anyway. There's lots of different ways that we can reinforce those attempts to communicate. And we can also use differential reinforcement to encourage even more progress. So that basically means that we give more reinforcement for a better attempt to communicate. So for example, if a child's just learned to say apple, and they sometimes say apple when they want apple, you could try giving them a larger piece and lots of praise if they say it and it's nice and clear. But if they sort of just go back to pointing to it and making kind of noise, then just give them a little bit, so they start to realize that the better attempts get more of the thing that they wanted. And if it's not something that you can break into pieces, then it could be that they get a more exaggerated response from you, or they get more time playing with something that they've asked for before you reset.
Yeah, you talking about is making me miss all the children. Just our lovely
I know.
So the next question is, my child is talking a lot about coronavirus because they're feeling scared.
Okay, yeah, that's so tricky. Like, it's just such an unusual time at the moment for literally everyone, and many people will be struggling with the situation, different aspects of the situation that are difficult for them, meaning that many of us are feeling scared and stressed, and worried. And that's understandable. And I think it's important to remember that children can often pick up on a lot of what is going on around them, even if they don't fully understand all the words they hear, or they haven't fully grasped the implications of what's going on. They are really porous to that anxiety that they might feel coming from others. And obviously that can make them feel scared too. And it's probably impossible to avoid it completely, but it is worth being aware of how often a child might be being exposed to maybe scary sounding news in the media, or just overhearing conversations between adults. Having said that, it is important to engage with children on these difficult topics at an appropriate level. If they're showing us by keeping on saying, oh, coronavirus, then they're showing us that they do want to talk about it, and we need to sort of find a facilitative way of doing that. In some cases, over the past few months, we've really tried to simplify the situation for our children to help them understand. But in a way, I sometimes wonder whether we're actually making things a bit more difficult for them and for us as the circumstances then begin to change. So, for example, at the start of lockdown, in order to help them understand why they're not going to school, we might have really drummed into our children, no, we can't go outside, it's not safe, it's not safe. And now the restrictions are starting to lift, and we might start to feel a bit more confident to maybe go outside again in certain situations. But there's not really any concrete frame of reference for the child to understand, why is it safe now but it wasn't before? Why wasn't it safe before? Why doesn't it look any different? So I think that's really confusing for the child, and it's almost like we've told them it's not safe, and now we have to backtrack and be like, okay, it is safe now, but again, do we even know that ourselves? So there's so much at play here. And over the last few months, the speech and language therapy team have been writing a lot of social stories to help our pupils try to understand different aspects of the various situations that families have found themselves in and asked for help with. So some children couldn't understand why they had to stay in. Some were happy to stay in themselves, but then they got worried about their parents going out. Some were scared to go out at all. Some were sadly grieving family members or friends. and many of them obviously didn't understand why they couldn't go to school and see their friends and see their teachers. Some of them got a bit too used to having a bit of extra time on the phone or the iPad and really didn't want to give that up. So there's been all sorts of things that we've had to address. And social stories is a way of using symbols with text, and for a child who can read, sometimes we don't need the symbols, but mostly we do. And we can use those to really clearly explain a situation and help someone understand why things might be how they are, what you can do in that situation. We always try to keep them really accurate and true. We want them to be as true as possible so the child can develop their trust in the message that's coming from that story. But obviously they also need to be as simple as is needed for that child's particular level of understanding. And they can be really helpful for supporting a child to internalize the important messages that we're trying to give them about a situation. That can be quite reassuring and supportive. If it's repeated a lot, they start to internalize that language, and then in the heat of the moment you can then use that familiar language again, and that can be reassuring. So again, if you feel like you're in a situation that's really difficult to explain, do consult with a child speech and language therapist, because we'll happily talk to you about the situation, figure out the exact nature of the problem, and then try and produce a story that you can read with your child to help them understand.
Yeah, that's great. I guess, like you said, because it's changing all the time, you can use these social stories to explain the change as well. Sometimes,
absolutely, yeah, you can acknowledge, earlier we said this, now this has changed, and now we're saying this. And you know, I've had on my list that, you know, when more children are coming back to school, we're going to have to start thinking about, well, okay, we sent home this big social story that explained why we can't come to school, and that, you know, it wasn't safe to go out and there was this virus. And we're going to have to backtrack from that and explain, like, this is what we've done to make school safe. We've already sent home stories like that for the children who are currently attending one of our provisions, and we're going to have to do that for everyone. And that is something that we'll definitely be providing for all families, to make sure that they've got something to support them to start saying, yeah, I know you haven't been at school for a really long time, but when you go back, some things are going to be different potentially. We don't know what yet, we don't know when, but it will still be an effective way of hopefully supporting the children to feel a bit better about that.
Yeah. Cool. And next we have, I give my child instructions, but they can't or won't follow it. What can I do to help? Okay.
So we've talked a lot about expressive communication, but this is sort of tapping more into understanding and receptive communication. So often we need to show children what we mean when we give them an instruction, or teach them, help them how to respond in an appropriate way to instructions. Often it helps to model or guide them to do the required action. If it's like a sequence of actions that they need to do, then we could make it easier to start with by helping with most of the sequence and then letting them finish it off on their own. And then we can gradually fade back our prompts so that they do more and more of the task independently and learn what it means when you say that specific instruction. It's important to remember that receptive communication can also be affected by the same factors that we talked about earlier. So feeling tired, being upset or angry, feeling poorly, being a bit dysregulated. So you might find that sometimes a child appears to understand, but not always. They also might be picking up cues from the situation or looking at what other people are doing, which can mask difficulties in pure understanding. So then when those cues aren't there anymore, they can't follow the instruction because actually the only reason they understood it before was because they were copying someone else, or it was the only obvious thing to do in that situation. So if you find that's happening, again, your SALT can help you to figure out exactly what's going on. However, it could also be that they do know what the instruction is and they know how to follow it, but they're just not doing it for another reason. We need to figure out what other factors are at play. And again, we might spot some patterns. Maybe there's too much distraction in the environment. Maybe they only don't do what's been asked of them in certain situations. So they might be fine at putting most toys away, but not the most preferred ones, or the iPad, or when we interrupt their favorite play, it might look like suddenly they don't understand the instruction to tidy up anymore. Or maybe it's the case that actually when they don't follow the instruction, they get lots and lots of attention because they get help to do it, and they get a bit more kind of interaction at that point. So that's really thinking about whether they're getting enough reinforcement when they do follow the instruction to make sure that they're going to continue to do that. If you do find yourself often in this situation where your child's not following instructions, I'd certainly recommend come along to our webinar on behaviour, which is not next week but the week after, on the 10th of July at 10:30. I'm sure Emily will be talking more about this kind of difficulty in that session.
And could you practice maybe like giving instructions in like a play situation, in a fun activity, just so that you can practice giving that praise when they have followed the instruction within a game?
Absolutely. I mean, developing the vocabulary understanding that you're then going to use in the situation where the instruction is key is so important. If they don't know what the words mean, then they're not going to be able to follow the instruction. So certainly setting up opportunities to practice things and practicing routines and stuff is really, really valuable as well. So yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Great.
Just before you ask the next question, I'll just let everyone know I'm going to enable the chat. So if you want to send a message, I'll be able to see it. So if you do have any questions that you maybe didn't submit in advance, or something about anything that we've said so far, you can use the chat function to type a message to me. And if we have any time at the end, we'll go through and see what's cropped up.
Okay, great. So the next question is, my child doesn't ask for things, but just takes the things he or she wants because he or she knows where they are.
Oh, okay, yeah. So this really comes back to what we were talking about before with that means, reasons and opportunities model for thinking about communication. So if a child can really easily access everything that they want, then it sort of makes sense that they wouldn't always bother to ask for it, especially if asking for things is effortful for them, if it's hard for them. So perhaps there are some small changes that you could make to the way that things are laid out or stored in the house, so that the child can still see what's available. We don't want things to necessarily be totally hidden. That can make it harder for them to know what they want and how to ask for it. But maybe thinking about not having everything always being freely accessible. Obviously, this has to fit into your daily lives at home, and I understand the pressures of that. So maybe thinking about even the smallest of tweaks that could potentially give your child just one more reason to communicate, or just increase the number of opportunities that they get to practice just a little bit. You don't have to change everything in your entire home, but just thinking a little bit about, is there anything you can do to increase those opportunities in that model? Yeah.
So could they do things like have clear boxes so that the child can still see the item?
Yeah, absolutely. Like if it's in a clear box, you can still see it, but the box could be out of reach, or the box could have a lid that they can't open on their own. If you don't have clear boxes, you could also label other boxes so that they can see, oh, this is the thing that's in there, but I can't go into it. You can have some tricky lids or something.
Okay, great.
We call it sabotage.
Yeah.
Just make sure that it's not immediately available to them, and then they have to figure out another way. That, if the motivation is really high, again, it's that this is the precious teaching moment when they've got the motivation to do it, and instead of just going to access it themselves, we can teach them to do something which might seem a bit harder for them. So it's understandable why they would want to go and get it for themselves, but if the motivation is high enough, then it's a perfect moment to teach.
Yeah, right. So the next question is, my child doesn't understand when something is broken or out of battery.
Oh, well, that's fair enough, isn't it? It's so annoying when something you really like stops working. It's important to remember that we all feel a bit frustrated with that kind of thing sometimes, even if we do understand what the problem is. It's like that thing of when the power goes off and all you want is a cup of tea. So it will be important to support the child to learn about what's happened as much as possible. So if something's broken, try to show them what's happened rather than just taking it away. If something's finished, show them their empty bowl. with some children you might be able to, you know, give a simple explanation of why something can't be fixed or why it has to be thrown away. So, you know, if something's literally like a shard of plastic, you can show them, well, this is dangerous now, so we can't play with it, and just give a bit more background rather than things just sort of really disappearing from their environment that they used to really like. But with others, they might not be able to access that explanation or understand that, so it may be more a case of trying to support them to choose an alternative activity and really help them to engage, and then reinforce them, because they're actually tolerating that disappointment at that point, which is really difficult. We all know what that feels like, to not have the things that you really wanted, and if you manage to sort of adjust and play with something else, then that's really good. If it's a battery issue with a device, I'd certainly recommend showing your child the process of charging and explain that. Again, we've already got a social story that we can send you that's about waiting for things to charge. Lots of children just decide, actually, I want it now and I'll take it back, even though it's only got 5% battery. So eventually it would be really nice to even try and teach a child how to charge something themselves, but obviously you have to consider health and safety and the risks of the electricity and everything. But it would be at least really valuable to teach a child how they could ask you to charge it, so you could have a little symbol next to the charger or next to the plug, so that they can go over and show you that this is about to run out of battery and please can you charge it for me. As I said, social stories can be really useful in this case as well, because you could use that to explain to the child that you do have to wait while the device charges. No one can use it if it's not got any battery. And then when the time comes again, you just repeat that same familiar language to remind them of what's happening. It will be important also to make sure that child has some alternative available while they're waiting, and that they have a way of accessing that or asking for that. Most of us really struggle to do absolutely nothing when we wait. You walk past a bus stop, you'll see most people adults are on their phones or reading or listening to music, because just waiting and doing nothing is really boring. So if you do have to wait for a device to charge, it's good to think about what are you going to do in the meantime, and does your child need help with that?
Yeah, it is nice to have an alternative or a choice of two things that, you know, they can just, you know, like have a box of motivating toys that, you know, you can do a swap with as well. That would be great as well.
Yeah, definitely.
So we've come to our last question. It is, my child doesn't understand work activities when I try to explain them.
Okay, yep. That's a tricky one as well. I mean, firstly, can I just say how impressed I am with all parents, family members out there who I know have just been working so hard to try and keep their children making progress while they've not been able to go to school. There are just so many challenges that families have faced, and it's amazing that people are still sort of really trying to do those work activities. I think especially when you consider children are so used to doing whatever they normally would have done at home, and the routines and expectations that we have at school and that they're used to at school might really be very different. So it's just a huge adjustment that they've had to make to kind of transfer their learning time to home instead. It's important that we bear in mind what we said earlier as well about generalization. So it can be really difficult to apply skills developed in one environment to another environment. And then if you think about it, at school, we have loads of staff, we're all trained. There's so many of us, we're there to support each other and step in when things are difficult and support the children. So there are also a lot of tried and tested strategies that we use at school to help children access and engage in different learning activities. So it might be about having some visual support so that the children understands we're going to do this for a while and then we're going to move on to doing something else that you really like. So that's a sort of a now next kind of visual that we can use, and there are lots of other strategies that we use as well. Often I think just receiving a sort of a letter or an email with ideas for activities that you can do, it gives you the ideas, but it doesn't necessarily tell you all the kind of little things that we do to make the activity more appealing, or to support the child's engagement. And obviously it's quite difficult for us to know how long the child's going to engage, or how many activities we can suggest, or that kind of thing. So it's something that the parents and carers, family members, are having to kind of really take on that role of that kind of constant assessment of how is this activity going? Does it need to be adapted? Is there anything else I can do? And that's something that is really, really tricky to do. It's tiring and takes a lot of energy and concentration and creativity. And so I'd certainly say, you know, always contact your child's teacher or your SALT or OT, because they can really help with making learning engaging and fun for the child. Also, come to our next webinar next week on Friday, the 3rd of July, at 10:30, because then we'll be focusing on engagement, and Amy will definitely be talking about some strategies that you can try at home as well. If you want to email your child's class teacher, it's just the name of their class and at manor.brent.sch.uk. And then we also have the dedicated OT address if you want ideas for how to maybe make the activities more engaging, or any equipment or strategies and resources that the OT team might be able to help with. And that's ot@manor.brent.sch.uk.
Okay.
We've got some questions coming in as well, which is great. So I'm just going to have a quick look here on the chat. Okay, so one question is, my child will ask for things when I am sat with them playing, but if I am not directly with them, they will just sit there and wait for me. They will just sit there and wait for me to play with them, I think. Okay, so yeah. So I think this is a difficulty where we've got two things going on. We've got communication and we've also got play skills. So we want our children to develop their personal play skills, their individual play skills on their own, but we also want them to develop their kind of communication within play. So we can model with a matched set of resources. So we could have half of the resources for ourselves and half for the child, and we can use that to show them what they can do with those things. And then if the problem is that the child isn't communicating within play, then we can make sure that we're also modeling that. So it sounds a bit like the problem is that in that case that the child isn't willing to move to make that communication. So if they're right there with you, then they'll communicate, but if not, they'll just sit there, or they will just play on their own. I hope I've understood that question correctly, whoever's asked that one. So what we're looking at then is thinking about how do we encourage the child to travel to communicate. So it's about really making sure that the motivation to communicate is there, and then teaching them the skill that it's not just about communicating with people who are right there. Sometimes they might need to learn to go and get someone's attention. Sometimes they might need to actually get up and take them a symbol, or take them something that's not working. There are loads of different situations where that could happen. So I think it's really important to try and teach those skills, and they are separate skills to just being able to ask for something when the circumstances are perfect. So we might sometimes need a second person to help us teach a child how to do this. So it might be a case of noticing that they want something, and instead of the main communication partner going in and showing them how to do something, we might have to then actually get someone else to guide them, maybe gently stand up, walk over, maybe even to tap on the shoulder of that person, or however they would normally communicate, so that they start to realize that they can generalize the skill of however they would normally request to requesting in this new situation, which means moving away from the thing that you want to go and get someone's attention or get their help or ask them for something. I hope that answers your question. Please chat again if it doesn't. Okay. Okay, so we've had another question here. This is a good one. We have lots of parents ask this question. So sometimes we see that a child's receptive communication, so their understanding, is in advance of their expressive communication, and this is actually completely natural. That's completely the way that communication typically develops. So we normally see that children do understand more words than they can express themselves, and that's the same in children who are typically developing, and often children who have communication difficulties will still follow that pattern. There may be some exceptions to that. So that's actually totally natural, in that the children need to have some understanding. They might not have that really pure understanding of the vocabulary completely, that they would be able to understand it out of all context, but they have some kind of experience or knowledge of that concept or that word before they can then express it for themselves. And as I said before, there's often that case that receptive communication sort of looks a bit higher than it really is as well. So when we do our formal speech and language therapy assessments, we would strip out all of the support that we normally give, take out all of the contextual support, and we're really looking at that pure understanding of it. Is the vocabulary understanding really there? And as I said, in lots of situations, children get really, really used to just following what someone else is doing, knowing what to do in that situation just because the context is there. Sometimes there isn't much choice about what to do in a situation. So I think that's it's really important to remember that in some situations the receptive communication might not be quite as high as it looks, but it is also totally natural for the expressive communication to be developing a bit behind that. I mean, if you think about it in terms of yourself as well, like there are definitely words which I can understand when I, for instance, when I read them or hear someone else using them in context. Maybe they're not in my vocabulary, so I wouldn't necessarily know how to use them, or I might not feel confident to use them, but I can understand if someone else says it, or if I read it in context, I can sort of figure out what it means. So often we do have bigger receptive vocabularies than the expressive vocabulary that we use, and that's the same when our vocabulary is developing as well. Okay, we might have time for one more. Okay, so one parent asked, my child uses one word or one word at a time, so like single words, but they can say more, and I want them to use sentences. So this is similar to what we were talking about before, about the child who's just started to communicate. The way to do that is really thinking about modeling longer sentences, so adding more so that the child knows how words can be joined together. It's also important to think about what kinds of words they already know. So if they only know the names of lots of things, if they know lots of nouns, then it's going to be really hard for them to start making sentences, because they might need some verbs in there as well, and some other things like adjectives and prepositions. So that's one of the reasons why it's really important to think, as we're teaching language, make sure that we're teaching lots of different types of words, because then when children begin to put things together, there'll be phrases that work grammatically. So it might be a really short phrase like dog eating, but it's got a noun and a verb. And if the child doesn't know any verbs, it's going to be much harder for them to build sentences. And there are some strategies that we use to support with this. Modelling is the key one, really, in terms of showing children in very natural communicative circumstances how they could say more. But it's also really important to think about if there are times when they need to kind of learn in a structured way how to do that. Sometimes we use a resource called Colourful Semantics as a visual prompt, and that can be really good because the colours coincide with the different types of words. So we might have symbols that have coloured borders around them, and then we initially teach in quite a structured phrase how to describe what's happening in an event or a video or a picture, and it's really helpful for the child to see what kinds of words are missing in those sentences, so then they learn to select the right one, and then eventually the symbols or the text can be taken away and the colours can be left as a prompt, so that they start to understand how to sort of make that progress in grammar and start putting their words together but also thinking about, you know, in those really, really motivating functional situations, can you encourage your child through differential reinforcement, for example, to add another word onto their request? That's another way of building it up so that they say whole or longer phrases, because they've learned that that's a way to access more of what they want. Okay, I'll just quickly have a chat about this one. I might not be able to, we might have time to answer this one too fully. So if you're the person who's asked this, feel free to email the SALT address, salt@manor.brent.sch.uk, if you want some more help with this. But the question is one that might apply to lots as well. So does my child repeats the same sentence many, many times? How do I reduce this repetition? So often we see that children engage in this kind of repetitive language where it's a form of self-stimulatory behaviour. So it could be that the child is getting some kind of intrinsic reinforcement from saying that sentence over and over again. It can also be a sort of almost like a reassurance thing, where if someone says a certain thing, they know how that person is going to respond. And often children who, I don't know the child in this case, I don't know who I'm talking to, so I don't know if the child has autism, but if they do, then they might be feeling that kind of anxiety and wanting to be able to control the communicative situation in some way. So asking the same thing or saying the same thing will often get the same response, and that can be quite reassuring for the child, but obviously it can be quite frustrating for us as communication partners, because it feels like we're just hearing the same thing over and over again. And it could also be a case of echolalia. So this is where children repeat words or phrases that they've heard. They might repeat them straight away. So if you ask them a question and they don't understand, they might just repeat the end of the question back to you. But it can also be in a delayed form, where they might repeat things that they've heard, or kind of script through things that they've heard in apps or TV, or they've heard other people saying, or parts of songs. And again, it is a case of providing them with the alternatives that they could use instead. So you might take part of what they've said and show them how they could vary it, or you might try to, if this isn't too difficult, you might try to draw their attention away to something else, so that they're really exposed to a lot of language that they could say. If it's happening in terms of a request, we might try to stop that. So if a child comes up and just says apple, 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 and you want them to just say apple, we might stop reinforcing requests that come to us as apple, 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 and just model apple, and then reinforce when the child just does that. So we can use that differential reinforcement technique again as well.
Thank you, Ellie, for all your great.
That was helpful.
And thank you everyone for joining us today. I hope you found it useful. Please join us again next week, next Friday, for our engagement webinar. And please send any other questions you've thought about. And hopefully next week we can join again and have a great meeting. Bye, everyone.
Thanks for coming, everyone.